watching on YouTube, and I apologize for anyone who was here at 6 p.m., which is when we said this Let's Chat was going to start, but we had some technical difficulties and we're back now. So thank you so much for joining us. You are watching Let's Chat, which is a show about American culture hosted by the American Cultural Center Algiers. I'm Emily Walker from the U.S. Embassy Algiers, and I'm really excited about our show today, which focuses on a part of American culture of which I'm very proud. The topic is making things like parks, roads, sidewalks, and more accessible to people with disabilities. So how is this a part of American culture? Well, in 1990, the United States Congress passed a law, and then the president signed the law, and the law was called the Americans with Disabilities Act. July 26th was the 31st anniversary of the passage of this law. So the 31st anniversary was just a couple days ago. The purpose of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. Specifically, the law guarantees equal access for people with disabilities in the areas of employment, transportation, state and local government services, telecommunications, and public accommodations. So this was a huge, huge law in America that changed a lot of things. One of the most important things it changed might be that it sparked a global shift of perspective from viewing people with disabilities as objects of charity, people to feel pity for, to people with rights who are actually contributing members of society capable of exercising those rights. So today we're going to talk about one thing that this law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, did, which was guarantee equal access for people with disabilities to public spaces like shops, restaurants and bars, theaters, hotels, recreation facilities, museums, and schools. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to our two guests today. First, we have Dev Pawar, a principal architect who's based in Arizona. He works at the Architectural Resources Team, or ART. It's a national architectural firm with a vision of diversity and a commitment to the community. Welcome, Dev.
Thank you, Emily. I'm going to share my screen here and hopefully you guys can.
Not quite yet, Dev. Just hold on 1 second. I'm just going to introduce our viewers to our other guest and then we'll go right to you. My other guest is Matt Jones. Matt is a Foreign Service officer, so he's a diplomat, serving his first tour in the U.S. Embassy in Algiers. He's previously worked as a court interpreter in California and a university professor in Spain. He's traveled to Costa Rica, Mexico, and throughout Western Europe. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much, Emily. Very proud to be here.
So you guys on YouTube can join in this conversation, which is about the Americans with Disabilities Act and accessibility issues. You can join in by asking Matt or Dev your questions in the YouTube chat, and then I'll ask them your questions. So we're going to start with Dev, who has a presentation for us. Matt, please feel free to jump in if something particularly resonates with you. This can be a conversation. But Dev, to start, so you're an architect who designs spaces so they can be accessible to everyone. What does that mean to have a space be accessible to everyone?
Thank you, Emily. To be accessible means any person with any disability should have the same level of access as any able-bodied person would. So in my world, when I'm designing buildings, what it means that any portion of the building, whether it's toilets, transaction counters, building entrances, parking, ramps, you name it, are all accessible to everyone, not just the able-bodied people, but even people with disabilities. And that's what I want to share today with you guys. There are a bunch of things I want to cover, but we will start first with the basic in terms of how ADA came about. And it has to do with dimensions of a standard wheelchair. There are certain dimensions in terms of width, in terms of the height, and in terms of how the person sees at eye level. And these few dimensions are basically the guiding principles behind everything that you will see in subsequent slides. This is an example of ADA parking. So you go to any building, whether it's a gift shop or a school or an auditorium or a theater, restaurant, you name it, anything and everything that has parking is required by law to provide an accessible parking space. The one on the left is an accessible space for a regular car, and the one on the right is a van accessible space. In between these spaces or next to them is an access aisle. And here is a real life example or picture showing that access aisle and a regular parking spot in which a car would park. This access aisle has to connect the ADA parking spot to the main entrance of any building. And this path has to be accessible with a certain slope so that someone in a wheelchair doesn't have to drag their wheels and or climb an uphill battle, if you will, to enter the building. These access aisles then lead to a ramp, and the ramp is shown here on the left as well. And with the help of this ramp, you are then able to commute from the street level onto the sidewalk level. And the ramps also have a certain limitation with slopes and widths and so forth, so that it's very convenient for somebody in a wheelchair to get out of the car, access the aisle, and then the ramp, and then the sidewalk. Here's an example of an access aisle that leads to a flat landing, and then there is a ramp that takes you up to the sidewalk on either sides. This also shows the accessible parking sign, which is meant for people who really need this, and the regular public is not allowed to park in these spaces. These spaces are also located at the closest point possible from the parking area to the building entrance. So the overall commute distance for anybody in a wheelchair is drastically reduced as well. This is an example of a street intersection, a typical intersection where you would come down on a ramp. And in this particular case, there is a different paving material also on the street, which is basically pavers where everything else is asphalt, to help guide people with disability and let them know that they are actually entering a hazardous area. These are just graphics showing the signage for the parking space and the pole-mounted sign, which is again shown here, and a little zoomed up graphic there. The next thing I want to talk about are ramps. There are always elevation changes from the exterior surface where you would be entering a building. And usually you would see steps, which is very inconvenient for somebody in a wheelchair to travel on. So these ramps basically help a person in a wheelchair to commute and reach the next elevation level, whatever it may be. The ramps have their own limitations and slope requirements. And after every 30 feet, they have to have a flat landing for somebody in a wheelchair to take a breath, take a pause, and then commute the next distance. The ramps also have a requirement of having a handrail, which is this piece here on either sides that you can hold with your hands. And then there is a guardrail, which is much higher than a handrail, and that's to prevent you from falling over. In this particular case, the ground is very close by, but the guardrail helps you from tipping over.
To clarify on that wheelchair ramp, that means that at every building, most buildings in the United States, I would say, the ramp has to be a certain steepness. You can't just build a ramp that is like ridiculously steep. It actually has to be safe and usable if someone's
correct. The maximum slope allowed by law is 1:12. So for every 1 inch, the slope cannot, the distance cannot be more than 12 inches. So if you have to commute, say 30 inches of distance, the ramp has to be at least 30 feet or more.
Well, our listeners don't use inches and feet. What is about 30 inches is they
2.5 feet.
Basically, the ramp can't be so steep. You can't just slap a ramp on something and say, oh, you're in a wheelchair, you can use this. It actually has to be safe and easy to use.
Yeah, and it's a very gentle slope. And then the landings also have to have enough space to provide a turnaround maneuvering clearance. That also changes based on the width of the ramp. Here's another example of a ramp to commute to different elevation levels. Then we have door clearances also as part of ADA. This graphic just shows various conditions, but in a nutshell, what that means is when you are pulling a door open, you need to have 18 inches on the pull side and 12 inches on the push side, which is what's depicted by a real life picture here. What that does is it gives person in a wheelchair enough room to get around the door, open the door, and then get out from the door. That's what that extra little space does. There's a requirement for toilets. Toilets have to be ADA accessible as well. Urinals, this is a standard urinal, and then you have one for people in a wheelchair. Similarly, toilets, they come with grab bars. You have grab bars at the back, you have grab bars at the side. And what this does is it allows somebody in a wheelchair to be able to transfer themselves from the wheelchair by grabbing the grab bar onto the toilet seat. The toilet seat is also an ADA accessible seat, which is a little bit shorter than your regular toilets. The seat is usually 27 inches, which is about 3 inches shorter than your regular toilets. Same thing goes with showers. You have showers and then grab bars and seating in them, again, to allow a person with a disability to be able to take a shower just like any able-bodied person would. Kitchens. With kitchens, besides the clearance that you need for somebody to navigate, you also want faucets and other amenities within very close reach. So a person doesn't have to reach too far out with their arms. It's one thing when you are standing and reaching for something, but when you are seated, your reach is limited. So these distances are much shallower in an ADA accessible kitchen when compared to regular faucets and so forth. With that logic, you also have transaction counters in public spaces. The transaction counters were typically usually designed for somebody in a standing posture. But again, if you are seated, you cannot see above that height. So what the law meant is these three over here are regular counters, but then you have an ADA counter, which is at a lower height and just allows a person in a wheelchair to make an easy transaction. If you have a reception desk, you have the regular transaction counter at this height, and then you lower it down to 30 inches for somebody in a wheelchair to be able to access and communicate. There is wayfinding and signage as well. Every accessible space needs to be identified. The signage needs to be posted at a certain height, and the signage has a hierarchy from the first place that you enter the building to certain subsets, which then lead you to the auxiliary spaces within the building. Each signage, I don't know how clearly you can see here, but below the letters are Braille letters as well for a visually impaired person to be able to read what those rooms or signage mean. This is a picture of a bus station, and in this particular case, the signage had to be readily visible from any point in the transit center. So they were located much higher. The law is basically about a line of sight. So it's not to be obstructed with any other hanging. Going to public transportation, buses have lifts in them, which allow a person in a wheelchair to get on the lift, and then the lift then gets you inside the bus. Same thing with light rail and trains. And this is a ramp coming out for a person in a wheelchair to get within a train. This is a school bus. Kids, again, they go onto a lift, the lift picks them up and then puts them inside a bus. Now, while waiting for a train, there has to be accommodation for a person in a wheelchair also to pull in and have the same access to shade and safety like a regular person. So you see these three chairs which are for able-bodied people, and then you see a gap over here, outside of that, that's where a person in a wheelchair can pull himself or herself in and be waiting in the same alignment as anybody else. These are seats inside a bus and or a train. These seats basically can be folded, so a person in a wheelchair can pull his wheelchair in and wait in that area. Now, besides the seats being folded, these seats, usually there are about 2 in every public bus. They also have securement straps that are used to hold the wheelchairs and scooters in place. Drinking fountains. I was talking about dimensions earlier with the wheelchair. So this knee dimension when you are in a wheelchair is about 27 inches. So whenever you get up close to any object, they need to have these slanting feature, which allows for your knees to be able to go in, and then you can access anything that's above that. This is the same principle that works with ADA counters, with ADA desks that they do for a drinking fountain. This is an example of a drinking fountain. And here's an example of somebody actually accessing it. And they are called high-low fountains, so that somebody in a wheelchair can access it as well. I want to just leave with a final example of a playground that we did here in Phoenix, Arizona for a nonprofit called Gompers. This is what the playground was for kids at this facility that had a disability. These are before pictures, and this was pretty much their playground. With the client's help, we converted this playground into an accessible playground, which is really unique in the country. This shows a ramp at ADA slopes for somebody in a wheelchair to get up into the play structure space. The swings are much lower compared to traditional swing heights. These little 2 green chairs on the side are very similar to seats in a roller coaster, where somebody can go in and then the straps are put on top of them and they can swing in safety. There are some audible devices here that people can play. Same thing here with these 4 different colored objects as well. And then they have a wheelchair swing. So if you are unable to get out of a wheelchair, this piece here, which is kind of hidden behind these black bars, but there's a zoomed in picture. It's almost like a basket in which you can bring your wheelchair in. There are straps to secure you, and then anybody can just push you and you can swing just like anybody else would on a regular swing. And that concludes my presentation, Emily.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Dev. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed seeing the pictures of how this looks in real life. I mean, I'm particularly struck by that playground for kids who use wheelchairs was ingenious. It looks fun, and it's a way for them to get to experience something that many other kids get to experience. It's almost a rite of passage is going to a playground. So I find that very touching, but also the things that we take for granted in our daily lives, like going up to a bank teller or using a drinking fountain. If you're in a wheelchair, perhaps you pull up to the bank counter or you pull up to a drinking fountain and you can't reach it. So I think those are really smart solutions. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily.
And to our viewers, Dev is a very busy architect who needs to get to his next appointment. So he has to get in the car, but he's going to phone us back in. So he'll be back in a little bit to answer your questions. So please do ask him your questions in the YouTube chat, and we'll get to those in just a little bit. But first, I would like to go over to our next guest, Matt. As I mentioned, Matt is one of our newest diplomats at the U.S. Embassy in Algiers. And he is going to kind of, well, I'll let him take it away, but he's basically going to share his stories about traveling and working as a diplomat while having a disability. Matt?
Thank you again so much, Emily, and Dev, really appreciate you having been here. Even though I have a disability and have grown up in the US, I actually learned a lot about the specifics of the Americans with Disabilities Act just from that presentation. And so, as Emily mentioned, I am really a brand new diplomat, and I serve here in Algiers. I was born with cerebral palsy, which means that it can affect many people, many different ways. I walk on a walker, and one of the proudest things that I can tell you is that my country doesn't care that I walk on a walker. They're willing to allow me to represent them, and that feels like just an enormous privilege. And I can't believe my luck, not only to get to represent the United States, and to represent the diversity in our country, but that I'm here in Algiers. I think it's a beautiful city. There's a lot that I don't know yet. I think Algerians are wonderful, warm, welcoming people. I have nothing but good things to say. I've even gotten to try some of the delicacies for Eid recently. Believe it's called, and I may butcher this, bouzalouf. I thought it was delicious. And so while this may be the newest place I've been able to travel, it's not the first. And it's interesting in terms of accessibility. I can only speak to what I've seen in Algiers, but I will say that while Algiers doesn't have the same, maybe some of the same helps to accessibility, or I have not encountered them if they're there as maybe where I'm from in California might be expected to have by law. I will say that it's not by any means the most challenging place that I've been in terms of accessibility. Let's see if I can pull up some travel photos here. And Emily's going to let me know if they're not coming through well. So let's see here. I'll do it this way.
While you're pulling those up, I don't see anything quite yet, but I think it's coming on now. Yep, I do see your first photo, but just a reminder for people watching in YouTube, this is Matt Jones, one of our newest diplomats at the U.S. Embassy, and you can ask questions to him or Dev, the architect we just spoke to, in the YouTube chat. But your screen looks good, Matt. I can see this beautiful photo of you and your wife.
Yeah, so that's my wife, Cecily, and probably the very most important thing you could know about me is that I have the privilege of being married to her. That is us in Paris, and of course, I think people hear that and they're like, "Oh, great, we have to hear about Paris again, right?" Yeah, we've heard enough about Paris for a lifetime. However, there is another side to Paris. And that is this. Is that coming up in a way I can't see my screen? That is this picture where I will say the most challenging accessibility experience I've ever had. It's the city of Paris. I think it's beautiful. However, this gentleman was kind enough to get in front of me as I tried to walk downstairs by holding onto a handrail, hand over hand. In the Paris Metro. If anybody's ever been in the Paris Metro, they are experts at building stairs. I do have to give them, in their defense, it's an old system, but there were a great many stairs here. It must have been, and it's like, okay, get to your train. It's leaving in 4 minutes, and the elevator is somewhere in this building, we think. We're not really sure. So you should probably run about 600 meters that way, and then you should take 4 stairs up, and then you should take 75 stairs straight down for no apparent reason. And also you should stay out of the way because other people are trying to use these stairs. And so this gentleman in this picture actually got in front of me and insisted. I didn't speak French at that point, but he made it very clear that I should climb on his back and he would carry me down. It was true kindness. I really appreciated it, but I thought it was a little bit disappointing that the Paris Metro system didn't have more accessibility features than that.
It's an extremely touching story, but I'm sorry that you had to go through that. And the Paris Metro is extremely hard to get around. Yes. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, so if for some reason, if that gentleman happens to listen to this live cast, he can know that he's made a real impact on my life by his kindness. This is the great mosque in Cordoba. I don't really have an accessibility story here, except that I lived near there for a while, and I think it's beautiful and historic. In terms of accessibility, I think that people may not realize that, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, that really, in some sense, most of the world is not particularly accessible. And I think maybe it's easy to know that mentally, and I've never not walked with a walker. I've never been able to walk without one, so I don't know what it's like to be a person that doesn't have a disability. But I would imagine that for many people, it is easy not to think about all of the things that might be involved in, I'm sorry, I'm looking for this here, in the daily life of a person who, say, wants to travel, who's handicapped. I'm looking for a picture here of the Vienna woods. Vienna is another very beautiful city, but if you want to go to kind of the main tourist part of the Vienna woods, it's up on top of a beautiful hill where you have a beautiful view, but that hill is not a shallow slope. It's rather challenging to get to the top of, and I felt like I'd had my workout by the time I got to the top of it. I felt like I'd earned my dessert for that day on that vacation.
And do you do any sort of pre-research before you go? Before you do a hike like up a hill in Vienna, try to find it on the internet, or are you so bold that you just go and see if you can manage to hike up a big hill?
And this is not the Vienna woods. This is the Schönbrunn Palace here. But I would say it's a mix, and I think that's different for everybody. I think for me, I'll do some research, and I will always attempt to find a hotel that is more accessible. I remember staying in a hotel in Italy once where we joked because there were about 6 stairs from the ground floor to where the floor that our rooms were on. And there was a tiny elevator, and I could use the elevator, but it was so small that I literally had to get in, fold my walker up, pull it in with me, go up 6 stairs, get out, unfold my walker, and then I could walk away. And if I had to go up and down, up or down the stairs, one time I had to do that once at the top and once at the bottom. And I remember thinking, well, I guess I don't have to be too concerned because this elevator is actually too small for me to fall down in. So these are things that, you try to avoid that in the place that you're going to stay, and where you're going to be sleeping at night. But I think for me, I have the luxury because I can walk even with a walker. I have a little bit more mobility than some people, and so I'm able to just kind of get out there and try new things. I understand that that's not an option for everybody. If you are not able to get up out of a wheelchair, there may be some mobility restrictions you have that I don't have.
Yeah, but your elevator story is a good point, and it's kind of what Dev said, that it's not enough to just build something.
Right.
To say that you built it. It's not enough to just build a ramp if it's too steep for anyone to actually use, and it's not enough to just build an elevator if perhaps it's too small for somebody with a wheelchair or with a walker to fit into.
Sure.
Think about who's going to be using these spaces.
And I think too, it might be some people's thought, and maybe I'm wrong here, but it might be some people's thought, well, are there really that many people that need to make use of these facilities? Is it really worth all the expense? I mean, look at any country in the world. Don't we have enough things that we need to prioritize spending money on without worrying about this tiny percentage of the population? And I would say this to you, that It is true that disabled people are a statistically small proportion of the human race, what we would consider disabled. However, I think often it's easy for us not to see folks who are disabled when we don't deal with that ourselves or know someone else who's dealing with it. And I think a question I would ask too is, are there no disabled people in your life, or do you not see them because they're not able to get out and be mobile in your society? So maybe you're not aware of them because they stay at home because they can't get out. And it will never be perfect. The United States is not a perfect country. Our application of Americans with Disabilities Act laws is, I mean, there are people that refuse to bring their buildings up to code. It's not perfect. It will never be perfect, but we can get better. One of the things I love about the U.S. is that I think most Americans believe that we can be a better country. And I think that we can all do that as humans. I think we will never be totally accessible where everyone can participate in every activity to the degree that they want. There are many jobs that I just physically can't do, and they're not able to adapt that so that I can do maybe just any job I might want to do because of my physical limitations. But we can get better. We can be more accessible for more people. And I think that's something that people in every country need to believe, that if we work together, we can be more open to allow more people to participate in daily life in our country and in important events in the countries that we are proud of. And that really, to me, is what accessibility means. It's not that I can get into your store, it's that I can do what everybody else can do.
Mm-hmm.
So forgive me, I get a little bit impassioned about.
Very well said. Well, we can go to some questions now. Is that the end of the photos?
There are a couple more. There's really nothing else that has a real accessibility angle to it, unless I were to show you. I mean, this here, that's up in one of the upper lofts of the Hagia Sophia.
Oh, wow.
We call it the Hagia Sophia in English. And beautiful. I found it breathtaking. When it was built, close on 1,000 years ago, somebody will correct me on that history, I'm sure. When it was built many, many years ago, accessibility was maybe not valued in the same way it is today. But I've been very impressed that, if I'm recalling correctly, that people that maintain it, or at least maintained it when I was there, made every effort to make it possible for me to get where I wanted to go and to see all of it. And as somebody who loves history and appreciates beautiful architecture, I really thought it was worth
Matt,
seeing.
how did that work? Was there an elevator in a 1,000-year-old building, or were the stairs just wide enough and deep enough where you could get up the stairs?
You know, I've been up so many sets of stairs that I don't want to. I'm hoping I'm not making a liar of myself, but I remember there being stairs, and I feel like they had installed a handrail, and the staff there, I feel like, were generally pretty helpful. And that really. Not all buildings worldwide are built for accessibility, but I feel like staff can make up for that to some degree by at least offering to help. There is, forget if I've shown this. This is the Alhambra, southern Spain, and that was actually fairly accessible because once you get up the mammoth hill it's on top of. Well, all of Granada is basically a series of hills, but once you get up there, it was actually fairly flat.
I've ever been to Granada. Yes.
Yeah, my feet were fairly sore at the end of the day. That's all right. I got my steps in.
Yes, you did.
So I think those are the best photos that I have. I don't take as many photos as I should of all the beautiful places I've gotten to go, but.
No, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing all those photos and sharing your experiences. We're going to go to some questions now. from YouTube. So again, you guys can ask your questions to Matt, and Dev is still here too. So you can ask your questions to Dev, the architect, or Matt, the diplomat. So Matt, a lot of people are asking you questions about Algiers. Mali Malu commented, he's gonna find it difficult to get around our towns and cities in Algeria. And Iman Badri asks about your experience in Algeria. Was it the same as Paris? Have you found it difficult to get around in Algeria?
I have to qualify what I'm saying by saying that I've only been here about 6 weeks. And I've been very busy at work during that time. So most of my time has been spent in the embassy. The times that I have gotten out, I have found Algiers, obviously there are not ramps in a lot of places, and there are stairs, but I've generally found it, I would say, easier to get around than Paris. I would say there are fewer stairs. And I think it's maybe a little bit flatter for whatever reason. There don't seem to be as much need of stairs here. Maybe it's the beautiful weather. They don't have to worry about flooding and things like that. And as far as finding it difficult to get around Algiers, I heard that before I got here. What else is hard? If you forgive me, it's also hard to become a U.S. diplomat. But they've let me do that, so I think I'm up for the challenge.
That's great. You are up for the challenge. I am curious though, and for our viewers listening, so when you're an American diplomat, you move to a new country and you work at a U.S. Embassy every couple years.
Right.
Have a say where we go. Generally, we can interview for jobs and look at a list of all these cities in the world and kind of think about where we want to go next. So Matt, when you're trying to find where you want your next city to be, how important is accessibility in your decision?
It's funny that you ask, because when my wife and I started our bidding process, or what we call it, looking for jobs this time around, at first we said, oh, accessibility is going to be very important. And then we said, well, actually, where my wife gets to where we go so that my wife can do research for her PhD is very important. And then probably accessibility after that. I'll be okay. And then we said, well, actually, we really would like to have good weather. We don't want to be too hot or too cold, and we don't want our dog to be too hot or too cold. And then we want to worry about my wife's PhD. And then way down at the bottom, maybe we'll worry about accessibility. So it wound up not being, it was a priority, but not the top priority.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's on the list, but not number one. Okay. Thank you for that. This is a question, Dev, if you can still hear us. I don't see your video on, but a question for Dev is, when did the US start caring more about accessibility issues? And then that question is from Hadil Budalia. So when did the US start caring more about accessibility issues? And I'm also curious, I know you've been an architect for a long time. How have you seen that change take place in building new things, building new roads, parks, and buildings?
So the first part of the question, Emily, I think you answered already when the law went into place. But the second part, just recently in 2009, there were more amendments to the ADA law where a lot more items were included. But as an architect, this law, ADA, is basically a civil law which was adopted as an ordinance into the building code. And what that means is that any building that serves the public has to comply with ADA, period. There is no exception. If we don't do that, the building does not get a permit. The plan review process, where you submit your plans for review to a municipality, will not approve the plans if you do not meet all the requirements of ADA for that particular type of occupancy and business. So it's a law. There is no exception around it. There are remote scenarios where somebody can apply for a hardship and say that doing these ADA improvements is really going to put them out of business, or it's going to be an extreme hardship. And you have to justify that hardship. And even after that, the law only allows you to go down a certain percentage in terms of improvements. You do not get a get out of jail free card for skipping everything. You still have to do a few things, and then the municipality or the city will look at what's the most core item that can serve the largest population of disabled people, and they will make you do that.
That's interesting. So if you guys
over
get
here,
that,
it's not a choice, it's a law. You have to do it.
exactly. It's a law. There's no exception, pretty much no exception, as Dev said. Similarly, Dev, we just got a question from Marie Harrison, who asks, are the specific accommodations for people with disabilities more expensive? For instance, is it more expensive to make a bathroom more accessible for a person in a wheelchair? Are these accommodations?
Yes and no. Yes and no. If you are doing spaces with accessibility in mind, then they are not at all expensive or add any cost. But if you are going back and then trying to retrofit a space, meaning if in your house you just have regular bathrooms, but now you have your mother-in-law or somebody else moving in who has a need, and now you're trying to retrofit it, that then becomes a little more pricier than planning it ahead of time. And going with that, I just wanted to make a comment. Matt shared some awesome landmarks in the world. And with those buildings, there were obviously no wheelchairs at the time when they were built. But retrofitting those in today's day and age is a much more cumbersome process too than just structurally making the repairs. You have the historical aspect also of maintaining the same materials and not destroying all the history that goes with it over the last whatever hundreds and thousands of years. It's very, very challenging to retrofit some of those historic landmarks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. So we have another question. Well, Matt, a couple of questions for you. Mali Malu thinks it's very sweet that you have a dog. And lots of us U.S. diplomats bring our dogs with us to Algeria, which is something perhaps people don't know. But another question from Imaine Badir. Matt, she wants to know if you play any sports, if you're able to practice sports.
Well, I have not really done any kind of team sport. I enjoy sport. I get most of my physical activity in working out in the gym. And really that's what I do the most. And that's one of the great things in some of the advances we've had in technology is that because of some of the workout machines, for example, that we have now, because cerebral palsy affects my balance, I couldn't maybe go to a gym 60 years ago and just pick up free weights and start lifting weights by myself without killing myself. But now there's enough advancement in gyms that I'm able to use several of the machines. And not that you could tell by looking at me, but I do enjoy working out. I've also done some martial arts, but it's probably more hazardous to other people than my other hobbies. So.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's see, I'd like to just maybe respond to a couple comments. Mali Malu just said, this is where we need to start in Algeria, integrating disability rights with legislation first. And I think that's a really good point because this happened in America. Things changed in America. Buildings, parks, roads had to change because of the law. This is an instance where it just wasn't a cultural shift. People didn't just decide out of the goodness of their heart, we should do this. It was a piece of legislation that changed a lot of things. So I think that's a good point that yes, sometimes these things do have to start with legislation.
And Emily, if I could just quickly, not only did it start with legislation, that legislation was, I believe Dev said in 1990, that's in my lifetime. I'm 36 years old, and in my lifetime, the US has gone from no legislation to the level of accessibility we have now. Again, not perfect, but has made vast leaps. For me personally, that's tremendously impactful.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple comments that just came in about spaces that are older. I mean, I think you have both touched on this, Matt, with showing your pictures of being able to access the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, or, you know, that might be difficult for older buildings to comply, but in the United States, it is still required. But there's a question from Nassim Bala who says, Algiers is an old city. Are there ways to make it more accessible on a limited budget? I'm curious, Dev, if you have any thoughts on that.
That's a very tough question. It's a good question, but it's definitely going to cost money. And without knowing the extent of things to improve in Algiers, it's really hard to answer that question. I have never been there personally myself, but I do know that the benefits definitely outweigh the expense, which may seem exorbitant upfront, but the level of access that can be provided to each and every individual without any discrimination, I think there is a certain component of, for lack of a better word, you know, profit with that as well, which cannot be calculated in numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a long-winded answer, but yes, I mean, there is going to be a cost to improving infrastructure, especially at this stage of the game.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Yeah, Nassim Bala. So the answer is yes, it is going to cost money, but it's the right thing to do, I would say. So I think we're going to wrap up there, but I actually first maybe just want to respond to a comment that Mali Malou said, are the elderly who might lose mobility considered disabled? And I would say, yes, they are considered disabled. Last year, on the anniversary of the American with Disabilities Act, I interviewed my uncle actually on this program. So he's a disability rights advocate and a lawyer based in Detroit. And he likes to say that the disabled club is one you can join at any time. All of us in our lives can experience something that severely affects our mobility and just makes a lot of things feel inaccessible to us. So I personally just think it's very important that we're all still have the right to live our lives and experience the beautiful things that make life nice. We should all be able to go for a walk on the sidewalks, to go to a beach, to see historical monuments, to go to a museum, to go to restaurants with our friends. So even if it's not a club that you're going to join at some point, and hopefully you will not, it's still just a good thing to do. So that's my ending comment on there, but I would really, really love to thank our guests, Dev Pawar, an architect based in Arizona. I hope you're driving safe in your car there to get to your next meeting. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for doing this and spreading the word. I think it's a great thing that you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, I think it's a great thing you're doing. I love seeing these photos of everything that you're building in the US. So thank you for what you do. And Matt Jones, our newest diplomat at the U.S. Embassy Algiers. It's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to Algiers. I hope you enjoy Algiers as much as I have. And thank you so, so much for sharing your story.
Thank you so much. It's truly been my privilege to be able to be with you tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And for everyone watching on YouTube, thanks so much for your excellent questions. This chat will stay on our YouTube page, so you can rewatch it if you so choose. We do a live YouTube chat most Wednesdays at 6 p.m. So please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I hope to see you again real soon. Thanks for watching. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Dev. Thank you.